Okay, welcome. Glad we're back for a topic that got us all going last week. We'll keep going this time. Jenny Yang is here. I'm very excited she's here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her bio, but then I want to say something about her that I've seen and learned as working with her. Jenny Yang is the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, which is in Baltimore. And she'll say more about World Relief. She is the co-author of the lead book you had to read for this week, Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth. How about that for Washington? Truth, okay? In the immigration debate. She was named Christianity Today's one of 50 women to watch. I didn't know that, Jenny, till I read that in the bio. So we all should be watching her very carefully. She's written a lot of commentary for a wide range of news publications and TV programs, including The Economist, New York Times, CNN, Washington Times, Christianity Today, Christian Post, CBN, others, and so on. So she's already at her young age, she's become very credible in what she says and the way she says it. But I've often admired, as I told her over lunch, when she speaks on this issue, her content is always very solid, very good, always teaches me things. But it's also her passion is very evident, her energy and passion. And the combination of those two is very compelling. So she is, for me, an archetypal young activist who is changing things, how people think, and even policy in Washington, D.C. So I tell her often, without being condescending, very proud of her, which I really am, as an older activist, to see a younger generation coming up and doing the work she's doing. So let's give a hand for Jenny Yang.
Thank you, Jim, so much. Well, I really learned from the best. I think Jim's become somewhat of a mentor and a friend to me over the several years that I've known him. And you really have in him just a fabulous teacher and someone to learn life lessons from. So it's really an honor for me to be here to talk about this issue of immigration. And I think in the way I'm going to talk about it in the next hour or so is to really see it as an intersection of faith and justice. World Relief, for many of you who may not know, is the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. So I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland, but we work primarily with evangelical communities in the United States on this issue of immigration and a wide plethora of different issues as well. So I want to tell you a little bit about my personal journey because I may look young, but I'm probably a little bit older than you would think I am. But I was born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and my parents still live there. And so when I was born in Philly, it was interesting because a lot of people know me currently because of my work on immigration, but immigration wasn't something I thought about at all when I was growing up. My parents were both immigrants from South Korea, but they came here legally. You know, we had no immigration problems whatsoever. But there are two defining moments in my life that really made me interested in this issue of immigration. The first is my junior year in college. I actually studied abroad in Spain. And it was really interesting at that time because Spain is a pretty homogeneous society. They don't have a lot of diversity. They don't have a lot of immigrants necessarily. But there were a group of migrants from Africa that were steadily coming because it's really close to the northern tip of Africa. They just cross the Mediterranean and they just settle in Spain. And in my just living in Madrid, I would interact with these immigrants every day, see them on the metro. They would be working at restaurants. And the way they were treated, and oftentimes there were racial epithets thrown at them just here, to the right and to the left, just living their normal lives, it really troubled me because I just felt like these were people who were fleeing war and conflict and yet weren't being welcomed in Spain at all. So that summer, I actually worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and I also just started working with an NGO combating racism in Spain. So that really shaped my first interest, I think, in this issue of immigration. And then after college, when I came back, I studied abroad, or not studied abroad, I went to Mexico, and I served with a community there through my local church. And it was really an eye-opening time because these were people who lived in utter poverty. And when I came back to the U.S., it was a challenge for me because I had a huge heart for the people there. And I just thought to myself, well, God, okay, I was praying this, if you grew my heart for the people of Mexico, what am I going to do to serve the people there when I'm back in the States. And little did I know that through immigration and people, a lot of them who were coming from Mexico, that this was going to be an avenue through which my passion for this issue, I think, really was going to grow over the next couple of years. So I started working at World Relief in Baltimore, and it was in 2006 that I used to work in the refugee resettlement program at World Relief, and then I took on a full-time policy job in 2006. And it was right at that time that was actually the height of the immigration debate. And so it's interesting because a lot of the questions that we're getting, especially from the community that we work with, the evangelical community, were some of these questions that you'll see right here on the screen. A lot of people were wondering, well, why are there so many people here illegally, and why did they break the rule of law, and they're stealing away jobs from Americans, and just a lot of questions that I actually myself struggle with before I even got to know a lot of the information about this issue. Again, like I was saying, it wasn't something I thought about, but these questions that I got from individuals, from community members, really made me want to think, exactly how immigration laws work and what the policies are and why there are so many people here without documentation. But before I want to go into that, I want to talk a little bit about the evangelical community, because I think there's a lot of, misnomers about this community in particular, and especially as you're studying faith and politics. A lot of what we know about evangelicals may be that a lot of them subscribe to the Republican Party, for example. And this was particularly interesting because there were surveys that were done of the evangelical community, the community that we as an organization work with. And study after study showed that the evangelical community, especially white evangelicals, were the most inclined to think that immigrants were a threat to the American economy. They were also more inclined to think that immigrants were a burden on our values. And so as I was challenged at my job to start educating and providing clear information, not misinformation about immigration, this was a challenge that I actually had to come up against, because the community that I was working in tended to be more conservative than the normal, larger society, and their views of immigrants were pretty, I would say, misinformed, but also informed by economics and political issues, and not necessarily their faith. And again, it's survey after survey. When you ask them some of the policy questions, most evangelicals weren't inclined to support any kind of earned legalization or any kind of relief for the undocumented immigrants who are here. And in fact, what's interesting is that 88% of evangelicals say that their views on immigration are primarily influenced by issues other than their faith. So like I was saying, economics or politics, but they never really thought about immigration through the lens of their faith. And the evangelical community in 2006 and 2007, when I just started working at World Relief, we actually had a lot to learn from other faith communities. For example, the Catholic Church had been teaching for years about the need to welcome the stranger among them. And in fact, if you read through Catholic social teaching, there's so much that they say about what it means to welcome the stranger. And they basically outline 3 principles: that people have a right to migrate, that a country has a right to regulate its borders, and then also that a country must regulate its borders with justice and mercy. And it was through really the Catholic Church taking such a strong position that really elevated and opened the door for evangelicals to reconsider their position, because all the surveys that you were seeing about how we consider immigrants a threat really maybe wasn't consistent with what perhaps the Bible was instructing evangelicals to view this issue. And so one of the ways that I feel like we at World Relief with Jim and others really started engaging on is, how do we combat all the misinformation out there? And how do we shift evangelicals from thinking about immigration not just as an economic or political issue, but as an issue of their faith? And the reason we say that is because evangelicals are known for a couple things. Not is it that they're just conservative most of the times, but a lot of them really take the Bible seriously. And if the Bible is very clear about a very specific issue, they'll take that into consideration in how they formulate their own attitudes towards a very specific issue. So we started dissecting this and saying, okay, how do we message this in a way to evangelicals, in a way that will help them have their faith inform their attitudes? And first we said, well, let's go back to the Bible. And evangelicals believe the Bible, and we were wondering what the Bible actually has to say about this issue. This is also an issue affecting the evangelical church in the United States. And then thirdly, we thought that this was a missional issue for the church as well. So one of the key areas that I'm just going to go over briefly is, well, exactly what does the Bible say? Because these are one of the main messaging points we've been using in really changing evangelicals' perception on immigrants. The one thing that we tend to say is, if you actually look at the Bible, almost every single major biblical character was an immigrant or had some kind of migration experience. Abraham, who's not just the father of the Christian faith, he's a father of the Judaic faith. The Muslims actually also derive their faith from Abraham as well. But he was the first immigrant almost in the Bible. God actually commanded him to leave his homeland and to go to another land that God would show him. And Abraham at that time said, well, I don't know where I'm going. Where am I supposed to go? My home is the only place that I know. Where am I supposed to go? But he basically was moved by God to migrate one place after another, and he took his entire family with him. And then you see in the story of Joseph, he was someone who was assistant to Pharaoh, and he was trafficked. He was sold into slavery by his brothers, and he was carried across from one land to another, and that really formed his identification with God and with someone who was faithful to God in that migration experience. And you even see the story of Jesus. He actually was a celestial immigrant in one sense, because Christians believe that he left the realms of heaven and pitched his tent among men. But then in a second real world sense, he was actually a refugee, because at the age of 2, he was forced with Mary and Joseph as parents to flee into Egypt, because King Herod had an edict at that time that all Hebrew babies under the age of 2 were supposed to be killed off. So he was a refugee at a very, very young age. And we see the story again and again throughout the Bible, both the Old and New Testament, of people who are migrants. But what we also see in Scripture is that God recognizes immigrants as particularly vulnerable. So you see verse after verse. For example, in Psalm 146, it says, "The Lord watches over the alien and sustains the fatherless and the widow." And you see this quartet of the vulnerable. It's the poor, the widow, the alien, and the orphan, who are oftentimes mentioned throughout Scripture as people who are really, really vulnerable. And again, you see ger, which is stranger in the Old Testament, mentioned 92 times. So it's not like a one-off verse that you see in Scripture. It's mentioned 92 times. And oftentimes they're mentioned along with other vulnerable groups as people who needed particular attention by the society around them. And you also see in the New Testament as well, Jesus has this idea of hospitality, this idea of philoxenia, which is the love of the stranger. And a lot of times when we talk about immigration today, we have this idea of xenophobia, right? The fear of foreigners. And a lot of that is actually what I think drives the current immigration debate today. But in the New Testament, there's this idea of philoxenia, which is the love of the stranger. And oftentimes when we think about hospitality or loving the stranger, we think, okay, if I invite my friends over for Christmas dinner and I have an awesome turkey and mac and cheese and, have all the works, then that's being hospitable. But in the Bible, it actually says that's not hospitality. It's not inviting your friends over. It's inviting the stranger, your enemy even, to the dinner table and communing with them and fellowshipping with them. So you see this theme throughout Scripture. And I think one thing that's particularly interesting as well is that as we talk with Christians in particular in helping them maybe change their attitude towards immigrants, one of the fundamental reasons why a lot of Christians have even started to reconsider this is not just what the Bible says, but it's also the personal relationships they have with immigrants in their community. When I first started working at World Relief in 2006, we actually started getting calls from pastors all over the country. And I will always remember this one call because there's a pastor in rural Georgia, and his church was predominantly white, predominantly rural community. And he said to us, one Sunday, there was an immigrant family that came into my Sunday service. And I had no idea who they were, where they came from. They couldn't speak English very well, but they have become ingrained in my church. And in the process of them coming out to Sundays and becoming part of our community, we just realized that they're here without documentation, and I have no idea what to do with them as a pastor. So he called World Relief because he knew we were an organization that worked with immigrants, asking us basic things like, okay, can they work here? What can my church do to serve them? Can they even have communion on Sundays? I mean, very basic questions, which seem a little ridiculous, but they just wanted to make sure they were right with the law. And in that process, we realized that this is not just an issue about the 11 million or the numbers, but it was an issue about this person that was coming to their church every Sunday. And it became a personal issue for a lot of these church-going people and just the larger faith community as well. It was these relationships that drove people to question why the immigration laws were broken in the first place. But I also want to, one of the most common questions I get about immigration is just, why are there so many people coming now? And it just seems like because the U.S. is pretty affluent and there's a growing rate of poverty in the world, a lot of people just want to come to the U.S. and settle here. But I think it's important for us, especially as Americans, to understand that this issue of immigration is not a new issue. In fact, you see conflicting attitudes between George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. And in 1750, Benjamin Franklin said, "Why should immigrants establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to change us instead of our anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion?" Now, he was referring to German immigrants at that time. And I don't know how many of you have German ancestry, but it's probably hard to believe that at that time people were against German immigrants. But the English were basically settled in the United States, and they thought that Germans had a darker complexion and they could never integrate. And the second thing is they didn't even learn English. They spoke German. So why would the U.S. settled by the English be overrun by Germans who would speak German and look darker and can't integrate? So that was a huge tension point back in the 1700s. But you see 30 years later, George Washington, he says, look, we are a great nation and our bosoms should be open to anyone who wants to come into the U.S. So he said in addressing a group of Irish immigrants that, regardless of what Benjamin Franklin says, this is the attitude and the values that we as Americans should hold, especially as we consider how we're supposed to found our nation with the ideals of democracy and freedom and things like that. So, that was somewhat of the conflicting attitude back then, and you see this continue throughout the history of the United States. And in fact, unless any of us have some kind of Native American blood, we're probably have some kind of immigrant history to the United States. It may be our parents, it may be our grandparents, it may be our ancestors from way beyond. But you see this funny cartoon by Geronimo, and he says, as far as I'm concerned, you're all illegal aliens. And you see on the Mayflower that it's the Native Americans that first said, why are you coming here? We're the ones that should be building a fence and keeping you out of our country. So you have this rich history. The United States is really unique in that we're the only country in the entire world that has one resident from every nation around the world. So there's one person from every country around the world living right here in our own backyards. And that's what makes the US unique more than any other country in the world. And so the history of migration, I think it's also important to remember that not all migration to the US was completely voluntary. You have the slave trade, basically in the 1800s throughout, where millions of people were sold into slavery and migrated from one place to another. But also in the 1820s to the 1860s, you see a huge wave of immigrants who are coming to our shores. There were over 5 million immigrants who came between a 40-year time span. And at that time, there was a higher percentage of people who were foreign-born than are foreign-born today. So there's a huge wave of immigration to the United States. Now, what's interesting about that time is that there was such a backlash, not just against Germans, but eventually against Irish immigrants as well, that people were starting to say, well, not only are they from Ireland, but they're Catholic. And we cannot have Catholic immigrants coming into the United States because we're a Protestant nation. And so there was this huge backlash against anyone who was ascribed to the Catholic faith, basically saying that anyone who's Catholic is not welcome in the United States. And so that sentiment of anti-Catholicism actually rooted it into a political party known as the Know Nothing Party. And a lot of you guys probably studied the Know Nothing Party in history, in U.S. history, but a lot of us probably didn't know that they were driven by anti-Catholic attitude. And they were so powerful, their main sentiment, that they basically elected 7 governors, 8 senators, and 104 representatives by 1856. So they were a force to be reckoned with, and they were primarily driven by anti-immigrant sentiment back in the 1800s. But you also see at that time that there was a lot of Chinese immigrants who were coming into the United States. And they were coming basically for free labor to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And so when they finished building the railroad, a lot of Americans started to say, well, we don't like how they look and we have no use for them anymore because they finished our labor. So I don't want any more Chinese immigrants coming into the United States. So what happened is Congress actually did a study, and they said, well, how do we limit the migration of Chinese immigrants to the United States? And if you actually look on congressional record, they actually found that the Chinese have insufficient brain capacity to furnish motive power for self-government. And they said that there's no Aryan or European race which is not far superior to the Chinese. This is actually on congressional record. So even back then, in the 1800s, there was this racial bias against anyone who was not necessarily English or Protestant to come into the United States. So that was actually the first restriction on any kind of immigration to the United States. And that act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, wasn't actually repealed until the 1940s. So you may be wondering, what has the response of the church been throughout that time? Because normally, a lot of people tend to see this as, not consistent with the values of who we are as Americans. And a lot of churches should have been speaking out, especially against the Chinese Exclusion Act, which seems like such a racial piece of legislation. And what we did see was that a lot of Protestant churches actually started defending the rights of a lot of immigrants. They actually, especially in California, filed lawsuits to protect Chinese immigrants from a lot of harmful legislation targeted towards Chinese immigrants. And you see this response of churches who are actually stepping in the gap to protect immigrants from really terrible legislation. So that's kind of a history of immigration to the United States. And I think it's important to remember because oftentimes immigration today is debated like it's a brand new issue. And we think, oh, the fact that we have so many people here without documentation, it must mean that it's a brand new issue to the US. But this has always been a problem since the founding of our country, from Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, all the way up until now. And it wasn't until 1965 that our immigration laws actually changed. And the current laws that we have in the books today are basically the same laws that we had back in the 1960s. And basically, any person who wants to immigrate to the United States has to have a family member in the US or has to have a job. And then there's limited ways for immigrants to come in through humanitarian reasons, for example, through the refugee program. But these are the two main ways that an immigrant can come into the United States. Now, very briefly, in the family-based immigration system, there's 226,000 visas available for someone to come in if you are related to a US citizen. But right now, the backlogs are so significant that if you're the brother or sister of someone from the Philippines, the wait can be up to 11 years in some cases. So if you filed an application in 2003, today, this year, is the only time that your application is actually being processed. In certain years, the wait time has been 15 to 20 years for a brother or sister of a US citizen to come into the US. So some of the waiting times have just been really, really, really long. And it's led to a lot of backlogs and a lot of hardships for families that want to be together. The second way that immigrants can come in is through an employment-based visa system. Right now, our visa system is heavily weighted towards people with high skills. So you have to have a PhD, you have to be an artist like Shakira. She probably has a visa to come in whenever she wants. You have to be a sports star, you have to invest $1 million into the US economy. But if you're a low-skilled worker coming from a place like Mexico or Guatemala, there's only 5,000 visas available for those individuals to come into the US per year. Now, that's the number of immigrants that came in through Ellis Island in a day back in the 1920s. And that's the number of visas we have available for immigrants to come in who are low-skilled to work on a permanent basis in the United States per year. So if you imagine in our farms where 50% of the undocumented immigrants are undocumented, workers are undocumented, or even if you look at our hotel industry or construction industry where 30 to 40% are undocumented, a lot of them probably try to come the legal way, but oftentimes there's no line for them to get into to come the legal way. So that's been the challenge with our current immigration laws. Now, there is a diversity visa lottery where we wanted to add diversity to the immigrant pool. So this legislation was passed decades ago. And if you're from an immigrant, if you're a person from a country where there's not a large representation in the US, you can basically apply for this and come into the US. And also, if you're fleeing persecution, you can actually apply for refugee status and also come into the United States as well. So I think I want to go into what are some of the most common myths that I've heard about immigrants. And these are myths that you may have heard as well. I think the first myth that I hear oftentimes about immigrants is that they're totally different than my ancestors. Because when my grandparents came into the U.S., they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. They had legal status, and no one gave them any problems. But again, if you look at the history of immigration to the U.S., and even now, before the 1920s, there was no illegal way for your ancestors to come. So if your great-grandparents came through the Mayflower or through Ellis Island, basically anyone who touched foot on land in the U.S. could actually go anywhere, and there was no problem. There was no visa before the 1920s. It was only in the 1920s where there was a visa enacted, and only after that point were there restrictions on immigration. So right now, the current system we have, where you have to go to U.S. Embassy and apply for a visa, that became the standard bearer for the system that we have now. But yet again, I think this myth that my ancestors were, morally superior or follow the rules better than the immigrants of today is probably like comparing apples and oranges, because there were absolutely no restrictions back in the 1920s and earlier. Another myth that I often hear about as well is just immigrants don't pay taxes. This is actually fascinating to me, and this was not something I knew, but 75%, especially of undocumented immigrants, actually pay taxes. The Social Security Administration has actually said there's billions of dollars that are funneled into Social Security that are actually being paid by undocumented immigrants. And they're never going to get the benefit of it because they're not eligible for federal benefits, but when they have wages paid to them by whatever company employs them, they're actually Social Security taxes that are taken out of their paychecks. So this SSA has actually said that if it weren't for undocumented immigrants, they think Social Security would become completely insolvent because they've paid into the system but actually don't benefit from it. Another myth that I've heard as well is just that immigrants are a drain on our economy. Immigrants, there is a cost to them, and a lot of the costs are often borne at the local level, but oftentimes what you see is immigrants filling jobs in the labor market that a lot of Americans won't do. It's estimated that 50% of all the food that we eat as Americans was touched at some point by an undocumented immigrant. So whether they picked the tomato from the field, or they transported it driving a car, or they cut the tomato and washed it in the restaurant, or served it to you as a busboy, at one point or another, an immigrant actually touched your food as you're eating your meal. But I think one of the most fundamental questions that I get today is, it's fine if legal immigrants come, but the issue that I have is with illegal immigrants, or what we like to call undocumented immigrants. And what's fascinating is that there's around 11 million immigrants who are here without authorization. Sorry. And what you see is that this is the pool that a lot of Americans actually have issues with, because they say these are people who shouldn't be here, why there are so many of them. And what's interesting is a couple years ago when I was in Washington, D.C., we were advocating for immigration reform. And what was interesting to me was that normally the people who come out are a lot of people from Latin America or from Mexico. And then all of a sudden I see all these people, a lot of them with red hair, and all of them had green T-shirts on, and they said, legalize the Irish. And they all came from Boston because there's a huge number of Irish undocumented immigrants living in the Northeast U.S. A lot of them live in the Boston area. A lot of them came here maybe 10 to 15 years ago. And it's funny when you see them, because you just never think that there's Irish undocumented immigrants in the U.S., but there's a huge number of them actually living here, and a lot of them have been living here for many, many years. When I was writing the book, Welcoming the Stranger, I grew up in Pennsylvania, and my parents were really worried for me, because they're like, oh, you're writing a book and you really need a lot of prayer. So they took me to my local church, and I grew up in a Korean Presbyterian church. And my youth pastor there, whom I knew for a long time, was praying for me, and at the end he's like, I am so glad you're writing this book. And I'm like, why? He's like, because at this church in the suburbs of Philadelphia, this Korean church, there's a huge number of undocumented immigrants who are here. And I was like, huge number, what does that mean? He's like, well, just in my youth group, I have 3 or 4 kids in the youth group who are here without documentation, Korean kids. And I was like, well, Koreans never break the law. How can there be any undocumented Korean kids? We're so law-abiding, we love being here. And it shocked me, because I didn't know any undocumented immigrants growing up. But it's becoming a reality more and more, a lot, especially with a lot of these churches. So I told you about the missions trip that I took to Mexico, right? Right after I graduated from college, and I went through my church, and back at home. And what's interesting is that because of these undocumented students that are in the youth group, they can't go overseas anymore doing missions trips because these students are actually not going to be able to come in because they're living here without authorization. So instead of going overseas to Mexico and other places, they do missions in inner city Philadelphia. They went to New Orleans and came back to Philly, but they don't leave the country because these kids that want to participate in missions can't go overseas and they can't travel at all. And you may have met people, I don't know, here at Georgetown or other places, maybe even back in your hometowns, that perhaps have some of these issues. But these individuals are known as dreamers, and it's named after a piece of legislation that would grant them temporary legal status, because there's millions of people who came here at a young age with their parents. They didn't even know they're undocumented until they apply for college, and they realize they can't get any financial assistance. So some dreamers can go to college, but they have to pay the full amount. Others can't even afford it, so they can't even continue their education after high school, and they work, low-end jobs and things like that. But a lot of them are valedictorians, and others, just stories I hear all the time of these dreamers that are encountering this really, really difficult situation. So why I think this issue is of particular concern, especially to the faith community, is because when you look at how our immigration laws are written today and the fact that they haven't been changed significantly in decades, and you hear about these dreamers who have these really horrible stories of not even knowing they were here without authorization and only discovering it later on, this becomes an issue of justice, right? And justice, I mean, a lot of times we know these people and we have relationships, especially with immigrants who are impacted by a broken system, but we don't tend to know oftentimes, or we come to realize that there's laws and policies in place that are perpetuating them being in the situation. And so over the past couple of years, we've seen not just a transition within the faith community of realizing how much the Bible has to say about why God cares for the stranger and how he wants us to act, but real injustices in our immigration system that are really compelling people to want to speak out and advocate for changes to our immigration laws. You'll see here one of the huge, not huge injustice, but one of the interesting facts maybe is the rate of deportations of individuals that were basically deported out of our country without authorization has increased exponentially. You'll see in the 1980s that it was less than 500,000 or less than 2 to 3 million. And then last year alone, it increased exponentially, and now the rate is, this is immigration enforcement. You'll see that the amount of money spent on immigration enforcement was less than 2 to 3 million, but the rate at which we're spending money on immigration enforcement is around 20 to 25 $1 billion a year, which is an incredible amount of money. And in fact, the U.S. government spends more on immigration enforcement than on any other criminal federal law enforcement agency. So whether it's the FBI or the Secret Service or the Drug Enforcement Agency, the amount of money spent on immigration enforcement actually exceeds all of that combined by 24%. And if you actually look at the rate of deportations over the past couple of years, you'll see that we used to deport maybe 200,000 a year. And last year, President Obama deported a record number of almost 500,000 individuals from the United States. That's the highest that any administration has ever deported those individuals. And if you actually look at the red and blue graphs, you'll see how many of those individuals have a criminal record and how many of them don't. If you're actually here breaking immigration laws, it's not considered a criminal offense, it's considered a civil offense. But what you'll see is that most of the immigrants who are being deported actually don't have any kind of criminal record. So these deportations have resulted in so many families that are separated. You'll see that there's 5,000 children who are currently living in foster care right now in 22 states because their parents were deported at one stage or another. And so you see this fissure of families. In fact, a lot of the calls we're getting from pastors has been the fact that one of the parents is deported, they don't know where they go to, and the kids, there's no one to pick up the kids from school after they come back. And so the pastors are not having to just preach on Sundays, but they're having to take care of these kids who either are going to be end up in foster care or be referred to their aunts and uncles who can actually take care of them, and hopefully they haven't been deported yet either. So there's this constant fissure of the social fabric of our society, especially as these families continue to get deported. And a lot of these kids that you'll see that are left in foster care are actually U.S. citizens because they were born here. So you see this fracturing of the family oftentimes as well. What's interesting as well is just that the immigrant detention system, there's this entire private industry that is funneled by people who are detained. And they're not actually run by the government, they're run by private companies. NPR over the summer did this entire investigative report that got a lot of attention that looked at how much money these private detention facilities actually get from detaining immigrants. So they get about $122 from the government per night for detention. And how they maximize their profits is if you want a pillow, you actually have to pay like $10 to actually get a pillow. If you want a phone card to call your family members, you actually have to pay for that as well. So just basic rights or things that you would think an immigrant would get in detention, they actually don't get at all. And so what's really even interesting, this NPR report reported was that some detainees actually are almost trafficked in these facilities because they volunteer their labor in order to organize books and to clean the detention facilities, and they get paid as little as $1 a day to do this kind of work in these detention facilities. But that kind of work helps them to get the pillows and the extra amenities that they're going to need in order to make their detention a little bit more amenable during their time there. And this is just one story of an immigrant I heard of that was actually in the New York Times. So he was from Haiti, and he arrived in Miami in October 2004. He was 81 years old, and he was a throat cancer survivor. He actually had a valid passport and a visa, but when he requested asylum, he was actually arrested and detained pretty much right at the port of entry. Because he was sick, he asked for medication, he asked for meds to help his high blood pressure and some other things. And the nurse basically accused him of faking his illness. And basically, he was transported in chains to the local hospital. And this was after days of complaining about his illness. And it was actually already too late. And what's unfortunate about this is that not only did he come legally, but he actually had family members who are U.S. citizens from Haiti in the U.S. And this story, I mean, it's one harrowing example, but it goes to show how much of our detention methods and practices are not even codified. They're not codified at all, and how they're run by these private facilities with little to no oversight whatsoever. Another issue of injustice, I would say, is just how immigration relates to trafficking. There's a lot of case studies done of people who are trafficked in the United States, and the large majority of those who are victims of trafficking are trafficked because they don't have authorization here. Just a couple years ago, there was a case that the Department of Justice sued these farmers because they were found to have been chaining undocumented immigrants to trailers. They were getting paid minimum wages to pick tomatoes. It was a huge burden. And so a broken immigration system is a trafficker's best friend because it really promotes their vulnerability, especially as they think about immigration. So, what can we do as individuals that know a lot of information but are wondering, how, especially can the faith community be active on this, and what are some lessons learned over the past couple of years? And I want to go through somewhat of this cycle with you for the last 10 minutes or so. The first is, we've identified this issue of immigration that is a huge problem in the United States. And one of the policy options we've suggested that we've advocated for, Jim and others, has been we need to pass immigration reform. We need to get these people out of the shadows and right with the law. We are already spending enough on border security, but why can't we spend some money as well to ensure that these people can get right with the law? And so our strategy over the past couple of years has been just increasing media attention to this issue, ensuring that evangelical churches and the Christian community in general and the faith community at large can really be vocal in saying this is not just an economic or political issue, but Scripture teaches us that this is a moral issue, that God cares about these people, and we in turn are also to care about these people as well. And I'll also share with you some of the outcomes that we've seen. So in terms of the policy angle, what we've said is we have to make it harder for immigrants to come in illegally. So we're not for people crossing the border, and we think border security is important. But if we're going to make it harder for people to come in illegally, we have to make it easier for them to come in legally. Right now, the visa lines are just minimal or non-existent, especially for low-skilled workers. So how do we create more flexible ways for them to come? And then lastly, there has to be some kind of earned legalization for people who are here. It's not an amnesty, nor is it an automatic path towards citizenship, but it will require that they pay a fine and they get to the back of the line and basically be in a probationary status in order to earn the right to stay in this country. Now, what we did over the past couple of years is we created a large coalition, and it's called the Evangelical Immigration Table. And what we said is there's a lot of organizations that are doing a lot of things individually in their own capacity, but if this is really a movement, if this is people that we want to remain engaged and to use our voices to speak up for change, we have to change our strategy and actually come together to use all of our capacities and reaches into different communities to say that this is an issue that deserves attention. So several years ago, we started to think about, who are the people that are from wide political perspectives. So both liberal or conservative groups, people who represent different communities, who did different things. And these are the 9 organizations we identified that had said something positive on immigration and were willing to work together to pass immigration reform. So you see the National Association of Evangelicals, the World Relief, the Southern Baptist Convention, obviously Sojourners with Jim, Esperanza, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition. This was a wide array of some of the most prominent evangelical organizations that were saying this is an issue that we care about. And we used our reach into these strategic communities to map out strategies and to actually work together over the past couple of years to pass immigration reform. Now, one of the first things that we did a couple years ago is we said politicians and I think just regular Americans are probably going to be really surprised at how many evangelical leaders care about this issue. So one of the first things we did is we created a statement of principles where we asked very prominent individuals to sign on in support of immigration reform. So you have people like Timothy George with Beeson Divinity School, or George Wood, who's a head of the Assemblies of God. You see Mike Gerson, who's a columnist at the Washington Post. Jim Daly, who's a president of Focus on the Family. And you see a wide array of individuals who traditionally may not have said anything about immigration, but now we're saying this is a moral issue. Our faith informs our values, and we need immigration reform now. Now you see this lovely picture of Jim right in the middle, and this was a press conference that we had just 2 years ago where we said, let's band together, let's launch this statement, and let's start strategizing about how we are to get immigration reform. And you see people from Focus on the Family, different churches, Stephen with World Relief, and some others who all were saying this is the time to take action. And our strategy was really a couple things. It was education and mobilization. We had a media strategy, and we also had a health strategy as well. Because I think with education and mobilization, you need to equip individuals to understand immigration laws, but also what they can do. Media strategy to ensure that there can be op-eds and thought pieces placed into prominent news sources. And then last thing is we need our political leaders to act. So whether doing Hill meetings, targeting specific members of Congress, these were all areas that we really needed to mobilize on. So one of the things we started was a Pray for Reform effort. And this goes to the mobilizing and educating. Like I was saying earlier, as people of faith, we're very serious about what the scripture says, and we're also very serious about praying. And so we started buying billboards in specific member cities and states, and started saying, we're praying for immigrants, and we're also praying for you. So this is not an issue that you can get away from, but you're going to see it every time you come home. What was funny is we even put the billboard on a truck, and the truck drove around the Capitol for like hours in an afternoon. And then if you see this little group of individuals, I don't know if I'm in there, Jim may be in there, but they were praying actually for Congress. So it was a visible reminder that our faith values inform our public attitudes on a hot topic like immigration. And one of our values is prayer. And we need to be praying publicly for our elected officials as well as the immigrants themselves who are oftentimes in really difficult situations. The other thing we did is, why don't we create a bookmark with a video where we list the 40 verses of scripture that relate to immigrants. This way people can stick it in their Bibles and actually read what God directly has to say about immigration every time they open their Bibles. So we distributed 120,000 of these bookmarks already. Almost every state in the U.S. has ordered these bookmarks except for Hawaii. They were our holdout. So if you guys know anyone in Hawaii that wants these bookmarks, we're always looking for individuals there to act on this as well. But this has been a really helpful tool for especially the faith community to really get engaged on this issue of immigration. And I love this quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, because he says, on the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that shall only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And so that, I think, quote, gets to the heart of why advocacy and speaking up for those who cannot speak for themselves is so important. And so what we're seeing now is just movement within the Senate and the House on immigration. In June, these group of 4 senators worked together to pass a bipartisan immigration bill, and now it's up to the House. There's 5 bills in the House right now. They're called in the Senate, they were called a gang of 8. In the House, they said, don't call us a gang. We don't like that word, so please call us a group. So now we said, okay, you guys are the group of 7, but we still call them a gang. But so these are all the members. There's 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats. The Senate bill, what they did was they passed a huge bill. It's over 1,000 pages. And basically it outlines border security, earned legalization, and all these other pieces having to do with visas. The House has said, first of all, we hate Obamacare. It was too long and too big. So when it comes to the immigration bill, if it is another long piece of legislation, my constituents are going to hate it. So if we're going to tackle immigration, we're only going to do it by small bills. So one bill deals with legalization. Another bill deals with family. Another bill deals with low-skilled workers, and on and on and on. So right now they have 5 bills marked up in the House, and none of them are going anywhere. They're just pretty much sitting there right now. A lot of us know that the government has been shut down, and I think now the question is, what is the House going to be doing moving forward? And I do think the budget discussions is really going to delay any kind of other legislative priority, unfortunately. So I think it's anyone's guess as to whether or not we're going to see immigration this year. But I think it does require us to continue to give hope to churches and individuals that are seeing this impact, to have them engaged to continue to advocate for reform. And these are just a few photos of just all the mobilization work we did over the past couple of years on immigration, and how the faith community has really provided a moral message on this. The Evangelical Immigration Table is one part of the community, but the Interfaith Immigration Coalition is another. And this coalition is made up of Catholics, of Muslims, of Unitarian Universalists, evangelicals, and across the board. So it's really been a diverse coalition that has also spoken up, even before the Evangelical Table existed, to say that this was a need that we had. And so this is some of the news coverage that we've gotten. One interesting that we've done that I don't know if you may be interested in, is if immigration is something that really interests you, is we started a G92 movement across college campuses. And G stands for ger, which is the Hebrew word for stranger in the Old Testament. It's actually mentioned 92 times. So we've seen lots of colleges actually take action. They had 1 to 2 day summits where Jim would fly in and talk. There would be worship services. Immigrants would share their testimonies. There would be workshops and documentary screenings. And a college campus can really get involved by just educating those around you. A lot of what you learned today, but there's so much more that you can do, and especially at a time when you're living in DC right now, especially at Georgetown. I mean, there's so much I feel like you all can do as students to educate others, but also to even meet with members right here in Washington, DC, because we're going to continue to have days of action where you can get involved, hopefully in the next couple of months as well. So with that, I'm going to end, and again, I'm just grateful for your time and for Jim's leadership and even talking about immigration, because as hopefully you learned today, our faith, I think, has such a profound influence, and even people without faith can understand to just the amount of potency that I think the faith communities can have in really shifting conversations and really revitalizing the conscience of the U.S. And you see throughout the history of the world of major justice movements, whether it's the abolition of slavery with William Wilberforce, or even the civil rights movement in the U.S., or even the U.S. leadership on HIV, AIDS, and poverty. A lot of this was born out of convictions rooted in people of faith. And that's really what drives a lot of our action on immigration today. So thank you guys so much, and I actually really look forward to the conversation and discussion. So thank you guys.
Thank you. Well, come join us, Jenny, here at the table. Well, that's...
That was a lot of info.
It was. And I don't know about you, but I wanted to read all those PowerPoints, and you moved on to the next one. Lots of stuff there. Lots of stuff there. Thank you, Jenny, so much. Last week we said that immigration is one of our subjects because it's an important issue in and of itself. It's a critical issue for 11 million people, for many more people. It's also, though, we said, Jenny, it's a case study, a good case study of how faith is put into action, talk about social justice, and even leading to policy change. So it's, as you, Jacob, said last week, it really has unified people across the religious spectrum more than probably most any other single issue I can think of. So what Jenny has done is given you a great history of the issue, but then how it's really now becoming this campaign. And so there are a lot of questions that we can ask her. I'm going to turn it over to you. But things like you were talking last week about how much of this, why are churches changing? Is it a faith argument? Is that what's going to work most? Is it an economic argument? Is it a political argument? What are the, and campaigns are really usually all of those things. So you know, Jenny's a great resource here for, and you also read from her book. So, and the good news is she can stay with us till 4:30, which is great. So let's take about a half an hour in response to what you just heard in the lecture. Then we'll take a break and come back and go into the readings, including the book that she and Matthew wrote. So there's Oprah Winfrey right there with microphone. So who's got a question or a comment to start? This group's never shy, so let's not be shy. There we are.
Yeah, so the word justice comes up a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what does justice mean? And to whom is it justice? Or for what purpose is it justice? And where do you derive your definition of justice?
That's a great question. So the question, I'll repeat it because I don't know if it's being recorded. It was, what is justice and what does it mean, especially in this issue of immigration? Who is it for? Who is it from? Things like that. I actually think the idea of justice really comes, especially for the faith community, from the Bible. And I personally take it from my reading of Scripture as well. And what you see, I think, in a lot of biblical texts is God's affinity, especially for those who are poor and vulnerable. This includes widows, orphans, and the immigrants. And I think you see also this idea that the people of God who follow after God are supposed to care for these most vulnerable people. And for me, I think when it comes to justice, and that's tied to advocacy for me as well, is a lot of times when you see people in these conditions, where they're oppressed or where they're living in desperate poverty, there's sometimes larger structural issues at play that allow that person to be in that situation of dire need, for example. So you can see this in overseas in contexts where there's desperate poverty. You can see it in the United States, for example, with immigrants, but victims of trafficking and others. And for me, justice really revolves around broken human relationships. And for me, that's really kind of been my impetus in understanding an individual's relation to people around them, but also to the community around them. And anytime there's broken relationships, I feel like there's oftentimes some kind of injustice there, because it's leading them to be in situations where a lot of ourselves wouldn't like to be found in. And so I think justice for me oftentimes looks at what are some of the root causes of why the individual is in that situation. And I think when it comes to immigration specifically, we see as an issue of justice, because when you hear some of these stories of these individuals who are kind of stuck in this system, who can't get right with the law even though they want to, it really comes around to this question of, well, what are some of the laws and policies in place that are leading them to be in this situation? And I think for a lot of conservatives, especially as I've dealt with this issue, it's been challenging because the biggest hurdle that they can't get over, or a lot of us maybe can't get over, is the rule of law. And they say, if these are people who put themselves in this situation, right? Because they're the ones that crossed the border, or they're the ones that came on the visa and overstayed their visa. So should we show compassion to them, or what's our response? Because they're the ones that broke the law. And because of that, they're living in this really, terrible situation where they have their kids here and they're being deported and things like that. But I do think that the larger issue is, well, what do our laws actually do and say? And we have a responsibility, if we live in a democracy, to change them to work for the common good if they're not. And right now our immigration laws they're absolutely dysfunctional. I mean, no one says that they're working right. So the question becomes, well, what do we do to change the laws to make them more functional and make them more responsive to the needs of families to be together, but also to facilitate immigrant workers who want to come and actually work in the United States. And right now our system does not reflect that at all. So I think that's kind of, I know it's very generic, but a lot of it roots from broken relationships for me, but also structural issues and root causes of putting people in situations of oppression as well.
Great answer. I would add to that, the word righteousness in the Bible is the same meaning. Justice and righteousness are the same thing. And one of the chapters I wrote in my book that I didn't require you to read is about what justice means in all that language, and usually it means making things right. That's the sort of common thing, making things right, the broken relationships, things that are wrong. In fact, the word shalom is not peace really. It's a Hebrew notion of fixing or mending, restoring right relationships. So that's what this whole day has been about. How do you make things right? Things have gone wrong. So the beggar quote from Dr. King is, you don't make things right by giving a beggar a coin. You figure out why is he a beggar, what's wrong, and how do you make this right? Trafficking, you can rescue women and children all you want from the brothels, but how do you end trafficking? So justice is more than charity. It's more than just showing mercy or serving the victims of injustice. It's making things right again. So most of the biblical language is about how do you, as Jenny said, restore broken relationships and make things right. As she said, not just personally, but structurally. That's really right there in the heart of the scriptures. Yeah.
Just to caveat at the beginning, I 100% believe that immigration reform is needed, so I'm not at all trying to argue that in any way. However, with that said, there are clear problems facing the immigrants who are already in the U.S., regardless of whether they're here legally or illegally. So in terms of immigration reform, to what degree do you think the focus should be on fixing the laws in terms of actually allowing more immigrants to move in versus facilitating additional social services for those who are already here? So I guess the more specific question is, where do you think it's most important to focus immigration efforts?
Sure. That's actually a great question and something I get all the time, because people say, well, you can't let everyone in, so how do you regulate who can come in and who can't? And I think one way that the current politics is shifting, which I would somewhat tend to agree with, is our immigration system. When I said our laws haven't changed in 40 years since the 1960s, it's based on this premise that the reason why someone should come into the U.S. is if they have family here. So a lot of politicians have said, well, family-based immigration is breaking our immigration system, because you've seen it's 15 to 20 years wait time. It just seems unsustainable. So there is this shift between actually limiting family-based immigration system. In the Senate bill, it would actually completely eliminate the brother and sister category. So if you're a U.S. citizen here, you were able to apply for your brother or sister abroad, but now they're suggesting to completely eliminate that category, so you can't actually do that anymore. And they're shifting the weight to employment-based visas, especially those who graduate from science, technology, engineering, or math. So STEM visas is what they're called. And this is actually it's a strong bipartisan issue, because most people are saying, all of us know that the U.S. education system is very weak in science, technology, engineering, and math. And for us to really compete in a more globalized world, we need to attract the best and brightest. And right now, how our immigration system works is, if you come in and get educated at Georgetown or at any other, really fine school, especially for engineering or science, you can't stay here. You have to continue being in school if you're wanting to be here on a valid student visa. So what a lot of members of Congress have said is, if we educate you in America's best schools, why are we shipping you back to China or India to have you apply America's best education to build a Google in China? And if you actually look at Yahoo, Google, all these other high-tech companies, a lot of them were founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. So you see a high capacity in immigrants, especially those in the STEM field, to actually want to stay in the U.S. So I think there is that shifting, and I think that it's a good shift to make, because it's an area that I think the U.S. is weak, that we could be stronger in. So I do think there has to be more facilitation in that. I also think with low-skilled workers, we tend to think high-skilled workers are just engineers, but if any of us have ever picked like fruit for a day, we know how even high-skilled, low-skilled work could be. And so I just think, especially with low-skilled workers as well, for so long, it is a skill that they have. It's a skill that a lot of Americans don't want to do. And yet there is no legal way for them to come in a way that protects their rights. So maybe even facilitating a guest worker programs, especially for agricultural workers, so that they can come in and actually work in a legal manner, I think is a huge thing that we should focus on as well.
So a case study here on this STEM issue, high skill versus low skilled. You get more bipartisan support for the high skilled immigrants, right? So the faith community, what we've come in to say what? I mean, what's been our particular contribution there to that controversy?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think one of the things we've been saying is, faith communities care about the family too. And so even as the Senate bills are gutting out the family-based immigrant provisions, it's almost like a false dichotomy, because people tend to say, well, they're family-based immigrants and they're not going to work when they get here. When most families actually provide social capital. So if you have your brother who's opening a business, you can take care of his kids, and it creates family businesses. In most cities in the U.S., whether it's Little Italy or Chinatown or all these other areas that have really seen revival in these cities, it was because of family-based immigration. So I think one of the things we've been saying is, let's not just focus on high-skilled workers or the economic value, but there's social value in having families be together as well, and that's something that we should focus on. So I do think there is that shift, but I do think one of the main messages we've been saying is, let's not forget about family-based immigration, and especially refugees, so people who are fleeing persecution. We have a responsibility to ensure that they're being protected in the U.S. as well.
So following that comment, or those comments, how much of your lobbying efforts are directed towards just sending the general message of we need immigration reform, and how much of it is trying to work with Congress and Senate and actually create and write the law?
Yeah.
Get the votes.
Well, I've actually somewhat divided my time between the guy I wrote the book with, Matt. He does a lot more. He's not based in this area. I live in Baltimore, so I'm in D.C. like almost every day. But he's been traveling to churches, kind of speaking to them, talking about this issue of immigration. But I spend most of my time actually on the Hill, so we kind of tag team efforts, talking about what are our values and the principles that we want to shape immigration legislation. And I would really encourage you guys. Immigration is such a hot topic that you will see, reading the news pretty much every day, something about immigration. And it's such a fun time because it's such a defining issue for our country, and you get to see how it's played out in the political process right now. Obviously, right now, they're not debating it at all, but I do think that it's going to require a lot more communities, more momentum. I mean, we've built up enough, I think, from a variety of communities, not just the faith community, but the business and law enforcement communities as well. What we like to call the Bible's badges and businesses, which Jim may have talked about. I mean, it's a really clever name because it is true. I mean, constituencies that are traditionally Republican are supporting this in large numbers. So right now what you see is just a broken political system where the American people are ahead of their politicians. They're saying that members of Congress should act, and yet you just see this political stalemate, especially over something like the budget, which, you know, I mean, you can get into that discussion, but with immigration, it just seems like a win-win. A win-win for our economy, a win-win for immigrant families, and just a win-win in just pushing our country in the right direction. And for politicians, because Republicans, especially in the last election, they got a huge slapping from the minority community. Over like 75% of Asians voted for Obama over Romney. Over 74% of Hispanics voted for Obama over Romney. And the Republican Party is just telling themselves, when you heard all the commentary on election night, it was all saying, okay, the Republicans have to get immigration right, because if they don't, their party is going to completely die off when the fastest growth in the U.S. is among minority communities, and they're voting overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party.
But isn't like immigration patrol like worse under Obama than it was under Bush?
Yeah, so it is. I mean, in terms of enforcement, Obama has deported the record number of people. He's been really criticized for that. He's ramped up enforcement, and I think he's done that because to win an argument against someone who opposes that, you know, comprehensive immigration reform, you have to show them that you are trying to enforce the law. So by saying, look, I've done everything I can, and yet it's still not enough, we need to reform the laws. That's actually he gets a lot of flack. So Obama is not, you know, off the hook on this, I think, especially within the immigrant community. They pressured him a lot over the past couple of years to take administrative action to defer deportations for young people. So that was a huge welcome step. But again, I think he's, you know, wanting to have political capital by saying he's enforcing the law, which will, he's thinking, I think, get more people to the table to say, well, we need to reform our immigration laws. But you're totally right. Obama has been, you know, spending a lot on border enforcement and security in general.
See, Andrew?
Can I ask real quick?
Yeah.
So Michelle Borstein of the Washington Post was tweeting all morning about something going on down by the Capitol. Were you there? What was that about? I think it was a bunch of mainline Protestants.
Oh, yeah. This morning there was a rally, I think, with a bunch of faith communities on immigration. And so they were, I don't know how many people came. I obviously wasn't there, but I think it was a huge sign. And, you know, Jim and I and others are really saying, okay, there's complete dysfunction between the political parties, but on immigration, this is the one issue that can restore the confidence of the American people in the political process. Because it's not a new issue. In 2006 and 2007, President Bush wanted to pass immigration reform. Unfortunately, it wasn't done. 4 or 5 years later, Congress has debated it. It's time to just get this done. Everyone agrees, most everyone agrees, that the policies are, you know, everyone can agree on what's pretty much needed. It's just getting the political will together to actually pass something. So again, I think everyone's kind of understands the need. If you see surveys, 70-80% of Americans support, you know, what we call comprehensive immigration reform. It's just our politicians aren't getting the message.
This is mainline Protestants, Catholics. It's sort of the other picture that you said, and they asked 100 leaders to get arrested, and they asked me to be arrested. It was 3 o'clock today. I said I've got class at Georgetown. So otherwise, I'd have been in jail this afternoon. But I chose you over jail this afternoon, and we'll see how it goes. Yeah, we could have had the whole class come. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have another question. So when we're talking about rebuilding, When we're talking about reestablishing the confidence of the voters in either of the parties and also the enforcement of whatever kind of policy is passed, it seems to me that it hinges upon the probability that this law is actually going to address the root cause of the issue. And that's what you were describing when you answered the question about justice, right? But I think that the issue of immigration is inherently a domestic and a foreign issue. So we can pass policies in the United States about the like how we're going to react and how we're going to address the issue. But does that actually solve the root cause of the issue? And can it account for the motivations and the sources of immigration? So, I mean, it seems that there's a large population of people fleeing from Mexico to come to the United States, right? So if we pass all of these policies to resolve immigration in the United States, is that a temporary Band-Aid for the fact that there's still an enormous motivation for certain people to come to the United States?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, because I think you're right. I mean, people say that even if you build like a 10-foot fence, if there's someone in poverty, they're going to climb over the fence with their ladder. I mean, it is, I think immigration is a result of global dynamics. What's really interesting in the past couple of years, though, is especially when you look at the border between the U.S. and Mexico, the number of crossings at the border has been actually completely at zero over the past 2 years. And a lot of that has been because of the recession that the U.S. has been going through. So what you see in immigration is an outcome of supply and demand, right? Is if the U.S. economy is doing really bad, a lot of immigrants are not going to come because there's no jobs for them to do. And so over the past couple of years, you've really seen just a complete decline in people who are crossing the border, because no one wants to come here if they're not going to find a job. But what you also see is that, you know, Ronald Reagan one time said, you know, it'll be the low point of American economic life if no one wants to come to the U.S. I mean, the reason that people want to come here for our education and our economy, these are all things that we as Americans should treasure. But I do think that there's ways to address that. I think a lot of senators have actually looked at legislation that would, you know, improve and provide support and humanitarian aid to countries where immigrants are coming from. There's also been bilateral discussions between the U.S. and Mexico to determine, you know, how to boost the economy of Mexico, because it's not even just Mexicans that are coming; it's actually people from Central America, like Guatemala, El Salvador, who are crossing into Mexico and either staying in Mexico or even crossing into the U.S. So even Mexico securing its borders. I mean, there's a lot of different factors, I think. And you're right. I think the fact that we do share a border with Mexico, I don't know if any of you have been on the border, but I mean, the land is the same, but you go from San Diego to, you know, across the border, and it's just like a totally different world. So I think as long as you have that kind of diversity or difference in poverty and wealth, I guess I should say, you're going to have people who are wanting to come over. But I do think that if our economy is not, you know, doing so well, that we're going to see a lower number of people who are trying to come. And the way that the Labor Commission is written in the Senate bill, it would actually determine the number of visas based on how the U.S. economy is doing. So if the economy is doing really well, for example, economists are going to get together and say, well, let's increase the number of visas for people to come in legally. But if the economy is doing really poorly, then there's no reason why we need to have like 200,000 people coming into work. Let's decrease the number significantly. So there is this idea of a commission where it's not just a stagnant immigration number every year, but it actually can change based on what we see as our need. But I agree with you. I mean, I think as long as we have, you know, everyone's going to want to come to the U.S. I mean, you talk to anyone around the world, a lot of them want to come to the U.S. But I do think we need to do it in a way where for the people who can come and work, that they do so in a legal manner, but we don't let everyone in. And I don't think, you know, I'm in no delusion to say that we're never going to have illegal immigration. We'll always probably have illegal immigration. It's kind of, in any country in the world, there's people there without authorization. But I do think what we're trying to do is to have laws to reflect kind of the economic supply and demand in the best way possible, and ensure that there are policies in place to develop some of these countries where immigrants are coming from, so they don't have to come. And, you know, a lot of economists are actually saying in 10 years they imagine Mexico to be pretty well off, where a lot of Americans are maybe going to even want to end up immigrating to Mexico. So, I do think that we have to be mindful of how much, the economies can change. Mexico wasn't always poor. Central America wasn't always poor. So I do think there could be that shifting tendency the next, 20 to 30 years or so. But it's a challenge.
I always learn something new when I ever hear you talk, Jenny. And one thing is related to that. I want to get clear. We're more money spent on immigration enforcement than any other activity by all these law enforcement organizations. How much money is that, roughly? Do you have any idea?
Well, U.S. immigration enforcement is like 30, I think it's maybe like 30 billion, but on drug enforcement, the DEA, the FBI, the Secret Service, all those other criminal enforcement activities that we associate drugs, everything, trafficking, it's like less than 24 or something like that. I have to check the numbers again, but that's generally the spending that our U.S. government does.
So related to your issue here, the amount of money that the U.S. spends on global aid and economic development that would help countries escape their poverty is so much less than that. When Bono talks about how much he wants people to spend, he wants 1%. That's all he wants, and we're not even at 0.5%. So there could be a virtuous circle of spending money on humanitarian aid and economic development, which leads to more economic growth and keeps us from having to spend all this money on enforcement. So and a lot of you were very impressed by the economic arguments that you read this week. So we're going to get back to that after our break. But that's a very good question. What the justice issues are always, what are the root causes? Why is this happening? Who are the victims, but what are the root causes, and how can we fix those causes? Churches can take care of undocumented people all over the country, but finally, what World Relief is saying, you can't just take care of people. You have to fix a broken system that is shattering their lives. So that connection again to the structural questions. Yeah. Please.
Can you pass it across?
So I suppose this is in a lot of ways a follow-up to that question. But in terms of domestic policy changes, aside from the actual immigration law itself, in terms of the number that are allowed to come into the country, what reforms do you think are most needed in order to support the immigrants who are either already here or who might come in subsequent years?
Sure. You're talking about like domestic policies to assist them in integration, I guess? Yeah, I guess a lot of immigrants, when they first come to the U.S., even legal immigrants, for 5 years, they're not eligible for any kind of federal benefit. So even if you're here legally on a green card, you can't access federal benefits. So I think one of the things that we're really trying to work through with churches is if we get some kind of immigration reform, you're going to have millions of people coming out of the shadows that are going to need legal assistance, that are going to need social services, that are going to need a plethora of different services. And I think what we've been trying to do is to ensure that in legislation that gets passed, that there is some kind of foundation or fund to actually help immigrants in their integration process. And that could be learning English, it could be learning civics, it could be helping them with educational assistance, especially for young kids. It could look like a whole plethora of different things, but I think the learning civics and English, I mean, there's no one who doesn't want to learn English when they're here. And in fact, what we've seen in our experience is that there's wait times at most of our ESL classes because there's an overwhelming desire for immigrants to want to learn English, and there's not enough services to help them. And so I think the English component is going to be huge in the months ahead. But I do think, one point of tension in the current immigration debate has been whether or not immigrants can be eligible for the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And in the Senate bill, they're actually not going to be eligible for any of the exchanges. So again, it was an issue of the cost of having these immigrants here. What's the Congressional Budget Office, they have to score every single legislation that comes out of the House or the Senate. And the CBO score actually determines whether a lot of members want to support a bill or not. And what's interesting about the Senate immigration bill is that they actually found that it would create $120 billion like over 10 years because there's going to be more people paying taxes. There's going to be more people working, coming out of the shadows, boosting their education. And so it's created a huge reason for senators to support it. And in fact, there were 68 senators who voted for passage, which is a really high number. Whereas the last time the Senate voted, they couldn't even get, I think it was like 54 or 56 senators that just voted for it. So, I mean, it's really a shift in the political environment with elections, in the economic environment, but also this moral and faith reasoning that we've heard over the past couple of years.
Yep.
So you talked about the privatized detainee like system that we have, and it's kind of troubling and disturbing, obviously, to hear stories like the one that you shared with us, and how the treatment can be so vastly different between private versus federal or government-supported systems and programs. But the thing is, or the fact is, that the reason why we have those systems is because the government just couldn't pay for them. So it's almost like they are a necessary evil, but then they don't have to be that evil. So I guess my question to you is, like, what systems can we have in place that can make these private prisons, these private, the ones holding detainees, how can we make that system better?
Sure. So I'll answer the question about detention in two parts. I think the first is, I actually think that I don't think detention is necessarily, it's not necessary, I think, in all cases. And actually what they've done is they've done studies that have shown that immigrants who are on probation and are not necessarily detained but can be outside with their families, not just in a jail-like setting, can be productive and actually still show up for court. And the reason immigrants are detained is because they're flight risk. So if you're here without authorization, then you get detained because the court wants to make sure you show up and things like that. So there are alternatives to detention. So that's one thing that we've been promoting is what's one way to actually make effective use of their time for them to actually be with their family members, be outside, still go through the legal process, but not necessarily be detained, which is a huge cost. So there are alternatives to detention. A lot of people even wear like ankle bracelets. A lot of, I don't know if you read gossip, but like Lindsay Lohan, she has like the ankle bracelet because she had a DUI. I don't know why I know that, but again, there's alternatives to detention. So that's just one way to consider that would be a lower cost for the government. In certain cases where they have a criminal record, I mean, yeah, totally, they should definitely be detained, they should be deported and things like that. But again, I think you're talking about people whose only offense, I mean, it's still an immigration offense, but they broke an immigration law. The other thing I would say too is what we've been advocating for is, you're right, I mean, detention still exists and it is necessarily oftentimes to ensure that people are not a flight risk. So one of the things we've been trying to do is to get a codification of detention standards. There is no code right now, code of conduct for how private facilities are supposed to detain individuals. No policies regarding medical care or anything like that. So we've just been promoting, there's individual standalone legislations that has dealt with this that have basically said codify standards. Make sure that if you're going to be giving billions of dollars, millions of dollars to a private detention facility, that they're going to be following the rule of law and making sure that people who are detained can get their appropriate medical care and religious services and things like that. So, I mean, it is an extreme case, but it really does go to show that it's kind of, because it is privately run, sometimes it's hard to know what's actually happening and making sure that they're following standards. So those are the two things that I would suggest for them.
So here's, we're going to take a break in a minute. This is the other case study for this course. So a day like today, you'll learn a lot about an issue. Information, history, framework, you'll learn a lot about it. But we're not just here to learn about issues per se. The class is faith, social justice, and public life. So when you start doing your paper topics, I don't want just issue papers. More about immigration, more about prison reform. It's about how faith or the faith community or religion or theology, how it's shaping that issue. Changes hearts and minds and perspectives. And in this case, changing policy. Last week I said, in this issue, prayer, as Jenny said, has been brought into public discussion. Prayer, normally a private thing in churches, prayer has become a public issue around immigration reform. People are praying for it, they're praying for members of Congress. Secondly, the Bible. Matthew 25, that text, is in the public conversation about immigration reform. And thirdly, how faith, in some cases, is trumping politics. People are deciding for reasons of their faith as a member of Congress. They want to vote differently than their history or their base would have suggested. So the good news is we're going to come back and do a reflection on the readings. You've all written about them. Well, the author of the main reading is here, and she'll be back. And so I want to really utilize her expertise on this, and particularly on those questions. Why, I mean, Jenny knows the issue of immigration very well, as you can see. But why does she think that working with the faith community is not just something she wants to do as personal faith, but why is that so essential to winning political success? The objective political observers, who aren't people of faith, would say the faith community is going to affect, impact, leverage this issue more than any other constituency. Why is that the case? What's going on in those churches? Why might that change policies?